am Lynette Roth. I'm the Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and the head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Harvard Art Museums.
And hi, I'm Penley Knipe. I'm the Philip and Lynn Strauss Senior Conservator of Works of Art on Paper and head of the Paper Lab in the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies.
And Penley and I are both very grateful to Lauren Hansen. Give a wave, Lauren, who's with me here in the Art Study Center today. We wanted to give you that lovely Art Study Center feel for this program. And Lauren has kindly offered to run our iPad, which is what we also do in teaching and have been doing when we were doing virtual teaching in the Art Study Center. So that will also give you a feel of how students were able to virtually interact with works in our collection while the museums were closed. Oh, I hear someone's sound. If you can mute yourself, that would be great. I do want to say though that Penley and I would love it if you jump in with questions as we go along. So we like to think of this as a little more free form because it will be a conversation between the two of us. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in and join the conversation. So I am very pleased to introduce a project to you today that really began many years ago while I was doing research on the exhibition Inventur Art in Germany 1943 to 55, which we held here at the museums in 2018. And I discovered the work of an incredible artist named Anneliese Hager and was able to feature two of her photograms in that exhibition. And with the help of the German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, we were then able to acquire Hager's estate, which included 31 unique photograms from the 1940s to the 1960s, as well as publications and documents that we now house also in the Harvard Art Museum's archive. And this led to a project which will launch on March 4th of 2022 here at the museums, entitled White Shadows, Anneliese Hager and the Cameraless Photograph. And it's really going to take a close look at Hager's work and her preferred technique called the photogram.
So before we dive in, let's go over what makes something a photogram. A photogram is an image made without a camera. Photograms are made by placing objects directly on top of a light-sensitive piece of paper, seen at left, and then exposing that image to light, and then developing that image, usually in a traditional darkroom. Things that block the light, like all of the things that you see on the left, the pine cone, the scissors, etc., appear white in the final image. And more subtle images are made by using items that are not fully blocking the light, that are somewhat transparent, like a piece of fabric.
And typically when we think of the photogram in the 20th century, we think of three men. And those were the men who rediscovered the photogram for the modern age. Christian Schad in 1919, Man Ray, and Moholy-Nagy, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy shortly thereafter. And we can see our incredible Moholy-Nagy photogram in the Busch-Reisinger Museum collection here and also on Lauren's Art Study Center CAM. The work of women, however, is often marginalized, and that's not that unusual in photographic histories that tend to privilege masterworks by predominantly male makers. And the study of photograms is really no exception. So although the fact that Hager was one of the 20th century's key practitioners of the photogram, her work has remained relatively unknown. And part of this has to do with the fact that she began her artwork belatedly during the Nazi period, which again was partially the focus of the Inventur exhibition in 2018. She got to know the work of Moholy-Nagy and other artists like Man Ray, therefore not in person, but through illustration. So hers was kind of a mediated reception of the avant-garde. And that fact was compounded by the fact that all of her early work was destroyed in the bombing of Dresden in 1945. So Hager, and what we'll look at in the exhibition, was likely getting to know Moholy-Nagy's photographs through Bauhaus publications, but also a magazine like the one we see here, which was really a women's entertainment magazine that was pitching photograms to its female audience and referring to Moholy-Nagy as the inventor of the photogram. And I love this spread because we actually see this kind of new woman of the 1920s with her short hairstyle making photograms under the light of a desk lamp. So the idea being, even in the 1920s, that somehow this was an accessible medium. It was something then that amateurs could do, and that it was associated also with women and not in the most positive of lights, right? So thinking about it as a kind of domestic task, something you could do as kind of a fun pastime, use up all those old razor blades like the one in Moholy's photogram at the top. So this association with women was one that really got me thinking. We see here another work by Anneliese Hager about what it actually means to think about a woman's embrace of the medium, and how might that shift our perception of it, or how can we think about the history of the technique from the perspective of feminist critiques and methodologies. And Hager referred to the photogram's reversal of light and dark that Penley showed us in that initial slide as white shadows. And I really loved that and embraced it for the title of the exhibition, because it resonated with me, not just in terms of the technique, but also, oh, thanks, Lauren. She published a book with that title in 1964, which you can see on Lauren's cam as actually original photogram, a book cover called White Shadows. But it resonated also with the fact that she literally has been in the shadows of the reception of this technique, and that the idea of a white shadow, of course, being something that's brighter, more noticeable. So we hope with our exhibition to draw some much needed attention to that. So today's program, we're going to take a look from that perspective at Hager's artistic production, but also the fact that I've come to recognize her work as really uniquely synthesizing both that avant-garde reception of the technique, but also its 19th century so-called prehistories. So in the 19th century, we have the scientific use of cameraless photography in nature printing and microphotography. And we also have vernacular practices like paper silhouettes. And those histories kind of run parallel to the history of the cameraless photograph. And were also largely associated by the end of the 19th century with women's art. So we're going to jump in with one of those prehistories also for Hager herself, and that is microphotography. Do we have any questions about the photogram before we launch into our categories? Anyone? All right, don't be shy. We really want to think about this the way we would as a teaching seminar. So students are sometimes shy, but sometimes not. So it's great if you also feel free to jump in. We see Anneliese Hager here in 1920. She was fascinated early on with the play of light and shadow in nature, and her introduction to photography actually came from the natural sciences. And so this was very important for me in thinking about her trajectory. In 1920, she expressed that she was not interested in so-called female occupations, in German, Frauenberufe. Those were the things that were available to her at the time. And so she began a 2-year training at the Berlin Letteverein. And that was a school that was founded in 1866, already to, quote, improve the position of women. And they offered 3 training programs, and we can see a course in photography. The photograph that I found here is from before 1912, so predating Hager's time at the school. But the students could take one of 3 courses: studio photography, medical technical assistance, or metallography. And the 16-year-old Hager chose the latter. And so that meant she was studying the science of the structure and property of metals. And during those studies, she did coursework in photography, and she also compiled photographic portfolios of macro and micro photography. And then she goes on in 1922 to be a technical assistant for microphotography at Berlin's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. That's today the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. And she was testing the properties and manufacture of wool. And we can see her here at the far right with a group of her colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. So in the exhibition, we're going to include a microscope like the one that Hager would have been using in Berlin at the time, and it's coming from the collection of historical scientific instruments at Harvard, which is very exciting, a collaboration for us. We also plan to show Hager's work with that of Karl Struve, who is one of the artists we have in the collection, who also did microphotography. And Lauren, zooming in on that on our Art Studies Center cam, we actually have a number of works by Struve that we were lucky to be able to acquire in 2016 with the help of the Tony Pepke de Bruhl Fund. So Struve too actually loved the microphotograph. He was not actually coming from the natural sciences. He didn't look through a microscope until 1924, but he actually said what he loved about the microphotographs was this incredible graphic quality. And because he was not a scientist, he said he saw these variations of black and gray and white. And he's quoted as saying, "I saw images." And we can see him here with a similar setup to the one in the diagram in the previous slide, where you see that his camera gets literally attached to the microscope so he can take these images at really high magnifications. So Hager was doing the same thing, but she was doing it in a scientific environment, and several of her microphotographs were published in 1925, and we can see them here. And as she was doing this work, she actually talks about how, looking through the microscope at the wool that she was studying, would remind her of other things in nature like horsetail, or she mentions at some point, they also reminded her of Cubist paintings. So she's very sensitized already to the way that this kind of abstracted view of the natural world, what it can offer her. And those unexpected views then really become the focus of her photograms. I really wanted to show just briefly this book by microbiologist Paul Lintner. It was a book that I came across, thinking about the connection between science and the photogram. It was a very popular book published in 1920 in Berlin, so where Hager is at the time. It had multiple editions, and it really functioned as a kind of manual for cameraless photography, again, written by a scientist. And throughout the book and some of the examples that Lindner uses, which we can see here, he's showing the very common uses of organic materials, leaves and flowers for photograms, which, of course, in Penley's initial example, right, there are some of the classic, things, the leaf, the pine cone, but also here we see in the upper right-hand corner, lace. And lace really became associated with the incredible photogenic drawings of Henry Fox Talbot, which we did try and borrow for the exhibition. Unfortunately, they're too light sensitive, but we will arrange a trip to Houghton Library to view those during the run of the exhibition. But Talbot's lace photogenic drawings, are in some ways synonymous with early cameraless images. And of course, lace is wonderful because it appears then in shadow, right? What's the white of the image really then does look like the original object. So the reversal, because of the white of lace, reads in some ways as close to the object itself as possible. Of course, we think of lace, and there's also a gendered aspect to that as well, like there is with a lot of the materials that are used for cameraless photography. Hager was also just using really what was around her home, food, foam, glue, pieces of glass, and organic materials that she found. And she really loved those graphic abstract qualities. So here we have a kind of combination from the 60s of foam and glue. And the foam relates back to Lindner because Lindner was a microbiologist who also studied a lot on beer. So a lovely German topic that we see again in Hager's work, where she also really loves to focus on how bubbles and foam can have this kind of incredible transparency. So we're going to go back now to our next category, and I'll turn it over to Penley. We're going to think a little bit about the beginnings of the cameraless medium and talk a little bit about cyanotypes.
Great, thanks, Lynette. So cyanotypes were invented in 1842, and I'll introduce the process before Lynette shows us some images. It's a complicated chemical reaction that's made by mixing together ferric ammonium citrate and potassium ferric cyanide, coating the paper with this chemical mixture, allowing it to dry, and then exposing the now light-sensitive paper to sunlight. The final image of whatever was exposed on the paper appears blue, and that blue color is Prussian blue, ferric ferrocyanide, and it's the same process that's used for blueprints. So you should go to our YouTube page to see an entire video made by our former science fellow, Julie Wirtz, about the cyanotype process, and I'll share that link in the chat momentarily. But what's nice about cyanotypes is that you can make them at home, and you'll see examples of making them at home shortly.
And I should say, actually, I did that this summer. I took a class on handmade photography and made some of my own cyanotypes. And actually, it was interesting. The more I did it, the worse they got. So there was something to be said for beginner's luck. So, typically in the histories of the photogram, I mentioned that 19th century female practitioners are often absent, but there is one key exception to that, and that is British botanist Anna Atkins. And Atkins, between 1843 and 1853, produced the first book to be printed and illustrated entirely by photography, entitled British Algae Cyanotype Impressions. And so thanks to a generous loan from Houghton Library, we will be able to include cyanotypes by Atkins in the White Shadows exhibition next spring. And she was using actually that chemical formula that was developed by John Herschel, who was actually a close family friend. So right after he basically invented the technique, she began to make use of it for her books. And she ended up compiling about 400 cyanotypes of British seaweeds in rare private issues of that publication. So we'll have a single work by Atkins in the exhibition, and complementing that, also the work of American cyanotypist Ella J.C. Hurd. Hurd, if you've never heard of her, there's a reason for that, because not many people have. In fact, it was a wonderful discovery here in Harvard's botany libraries, and thanks to my colleagues there for helping me narrow in on that as I was looking at examples of nature printing for the show. And actually, these works are currently being digitized to make Hurd's work more accessible to researchers and to the public. But Hurd was an amateur cyanotypist interested in the natural sciences, and she documented ferns in Long Island where she lived, and also in Florida, and actually had some ferns given to her from Europe, and she printed those as well. And you can really see here the incredible Prussian blue that is the marker of cyanotype. And more importantly, for the exhibition, we're going to show those in the album that Hurd compiled them in to underscore really that kind of scientific standardized use of cyanotypes by women makers, and especially unknown women makers like Hurd. And if we go back and look at a work by Anneliese Hager, we can see that Hager is using that same kind of plant material. Again, though, she is doing this with gelatin silver prints, so she's developing them and is not using the cyanotype process. But she here also combines those flowers that she's applied directly to the light sensitive surface. She's also adding in paper cutouts, or actually here a kind of mask where she's cut out a sort of biomorphic form. And that's really, I think, a great segue to think about the history of the silhouette and cutting and pasting paper. And that's our next category for so-called prehistory of the photogram. And in fact, actually, if we look at this fantastic cut paper work by Philip Otto Runge, at first we could actually think, oh, is that a cyanotype? Because of this incredible blue, but he has actually laid the cut paper silhouette on a blue paper. And Runge is extremely well known for his silhouettes of plants and animals and genre scenes and fairy tales. And here, this incredible silhouette of oak leaves in the Fogg Museum collection will complement Hager's work in the exhibition next spring.
And you can kind of really see when Lauren zoomed in the three-dimensionality of that paper resting on top of the blue paper. That's really nice. That's a cut white paper. So I'm going to talk briefly about silhouettes and how they tie to Hager's work. And obviously, these two Hager photograms make really clear that the artist is experimenting with just the classic silhouetted form, the portrait head. And apparently this is Hager's own profile. And we'll talk more about how some of these photograms were made in a minute, but suffice it to say that here Hager's cutting out her own paper head and then using the form and its negative, the remaining outside of the paper with the portrait kind of dropped out to make this image. And the silhouette as a form of portraiture was really popular in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So yeah, it was the first time that portraiture was really available to the masses. Because silhouette cutters traveled around to the sitters, it was really available. They traveled around and offered these portraits for very little money, and you could have them done really quickly. So they were just available much more readily. There were professional silhouettists like Edouard, and here I'm showing a page from our incredible album of his cutout full figure silhouettes. Edouard was the most well-known of all the silhouettists, and his skill was unmatched. We have the album here today, and Lauren's showing my very favorite page in live to you, which is this silhouette of a boy and his dog, and that chest hair is the ruff is just rendered in this incredible way. Silhouettes were popular around this time, and they were cut by regular people too, not just artists. Cutting a loved one silhouette was a drawing room hobby. It was a domestic pastime, bringing us back to one of today's themes, that of women and their work, and its sometimes low status. And I have a perfect example of this kind of amateur silhouette. It's not part of the Harvard Art Museum's collection, but it's a local example for me. It's just down the street from where I'm speaking to you today. This life-size hollow cut is at the 1734 Hancock Clark House in Lexington. If one looks at it, you can see that it's drawn from life, likely using a candle in front of a sitter to cast a shadow. The sitter is Reverend Jonas Clark, and he was a clergyman in Lexington, and he was the cousin of John Hancock, apparently through marriage. And here's the back of that silhouette. Again, the outside, the negative of the portrait. So again, they're called hollow cuts. And the paper of the Clark hollow cut has a previous life. It's really interesting. So the neck, yeah, perfect, Lynette, thanks. On the back, in 1797, a schoolgirl called Eliza Eaton wrote out in a fancy kind of manner the words to the song Columbia. The work was likely a presentation piece for school based on the handwriting, the flourishes, and the large size of the paper. And down at the bottom, it says Eliza Eaton, 1797, and it says Derby School. The somewhat clunky silhouette of the Reverend Clark is a perfect example of a homemade silhouette. It's amateurishly cut by a schoolgirl from recycled materials at hand, like this big piece of paper, and probably using embroidery scissors, something else you would find in the women's domain at home. Such silhouettes make excellent counterpoints to the refined work of practicing artists like Edouard. And they speak to the range of skills, materials, and formats found in silhouettes. And the silhouette reminds me of Hoeger's work in some ways, in that Eliza Eaton was not working with commercially available papers, which were available. She's working with what she has at home, just like Hoeger's making do during the war with what she has to make her art. The fact that a young girl made this also underscores, again, the domestic nature of the silhouette. They were made at home, just like other domestic arts like embroidery and, like we were talking about, fern work. So I'm going to walk us through the recreation of two of the Hoegers. I don't have access at home to a dark room, so what I used was the commercially available cyanotype paper, and that's what I'm showing you here. You can just buy it from Amazon. Again, it gets exposed in the sun and just rinsed in tap water. And the first photogram we're going to talk about is this untitled one from 1947 to 49. While I'm explaining this, the original Hoeger will stay at the upper left. So first I started with a piece of plexiglass coated with black paint, and that black paint blocks the light from passing through to the photosensitized paper. So that's the next one, Lynette. So here's the piece of plexi on the right with the black paint. And here, that's the black paint in the next slide has been scratched away to kind of mimic this undulating form that Hoeger made with the partially scratched away, so the light can pass through. And again, the top and bottom are mostly blocked, and so they'll appear white. And then I added string to block the light in this looping, wiggling white form you see at the upper left. And the blue peeking through, this is the real setup. So the blue peeking through is a cyanotype paper, the light sensitive paper. And then I made a paper mask to let the light only pass through the three black shapes at the upper left. So these are cut away from the mask to let the light pass through, exposing the cyanotype in only these areas for only part of the time too. And then the next slide shows you the setup with the paper mask in place over the white string and over the scratch plexi, all sitting on top of the cyanotype paper, the photosensitized paper. And then the final result looks like what you see here. So the cyanotype is not as sensitive as the silver gelatin paper. So the result is less contrasty and more muted. But it's just an approximation to try to figure out, how exactly these were made. And it was something I did during the pandemic. The first summer I was home, and it was really kind of challenging to try to figure out how these were done. So we're going to move to a slightly more complicated example that you've seen before. And Lynette, did you want to say something about this next example again?
I was just going to say that it is a testament, I think, to also the kind of work we do in the materials lab with students and visitors, that of course, if you have to try and make it yourself and learn the techniques, it really helps you unpack the complexity of this work. And so, from that sort of first example that you showed, Penley, to explain, the reversal of the photogram, right? Literally just placing something on the surface and exposing it to light, to what we're looking at here with Hoeger's self-portrait from 1947, which really is a key work for me and also for the exhibition, how complex her process is. And this actually is, as you can see in the media field, not just a photogram, but also a photograph. So she's even combining those two techniques, and it makes it very explicit on the mat of the work, which I think we could probably see the way that it's matted right now. At the bottom, she actually calls out that this is a photogram and a photograph. So that was very important to her.
Well, that's interesting. The distinction is important enough to her that she noted it. Yeah, this last example that I'll walk you through, the recreation, is much more complicated, but it's kind of a good one to build from the earlier one with the two silhouetted heads, and then the one we just looked at. Because yes, Hoeger has exposed a traditional negative right at the center, and that's what the face you see at the center that's realistically rendered with full dimensionality. That's a negative exposed onto paper as a traditional photograph. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that she has also taken these portraits, these silhouetted figures, and she's created this mask. And that is the photogram. That's part of the photogram process. She's laid down this mask with these two profile heads as the only places where light can pass through. And so she's exposing that there. And then the next one shows us where the piece of fabric was laid down onto the photosensitized paper. Again, blocking the light, but in a transparent way that I kind of alluded to in the beginning, the opposite of kind of the scissors and the pine cone. This is letting light pass through and is much more kind of interesting form. And then the hand at right was done with a piece of paper that blocked the light almost completely. So that's, yep. Except where the hair is, and then some light was allowed to pass through for part of the time. So my first attempt is in the next slide, and I had to use what I had at home. So I grabbed a laundry bag to kind of approximate that textile, and I had the paper mask and the hand mask, and I kind of drew the lines on a piece of plexi to approximate these kind of wavering lines in the back, but I wasn't very satisfied with this, so I tried another time. And in the next one, you'll see what I did was I basically used a printout of Hoeger's work as a kind of photo negative. So it's a way that I could at home print out onto the photosensitized paper her portrait. And you see pretty well here too, the paper mask with the two portraits cut out, and then the hand is cut out separately so that I can remove that for part of the time. And the end result again is obviously blue, not black and white, and much less contrasty than, or much more contrasty, much less subtle than what Hoeger gets, but it was the way to unpack how she's approaching her work and what she's doing to get to these complicated images. So if we go to this next image, just going to review one more time. This complex print was made by using both traditional photographic techniques and the photogram. She did this by exposing the negative of her face at center, by laying a textile down at the bottom left, and by using two masks, one that had the profiles cut out and one that had the hand cut out.
Yeah, and I mean, and that really is, I mean, we have other very complex examples, but I would say that that is certainly one I wasn't prepared to tackle in my cyanotype making this summer. But you can really see where she takes the technique, and also even in the use of the textile in the early portrait on the left, right? I have to be reminded of those early experiments with wool and thinking about the structure and elasticity of wool, and looking at wool through the microscope, and that she does have an incredible affinity, which we see throughout all of her work, for fabric. And on the right, and Lauren's showing it on the Art Studies Center cam, is a much later work called Lost Visage from 1963. And in fact, these two works kind of bookend the show. So I mentioned that her work before 1945 was destroyed in the bombing of Dresden. And so she was really only able to start making photograms again in 1947, when she gets the photographic material from a close colleague and friend, Otto Umber, known as Umbo. and begins making then the photograms like the one we see at the left. And by the time we get to Lost Visage in 1963, she's actually abandoned a lot of that layering of different techniques and has actually returned in some ways to the sort of origin of that contact print. And we see what here could be a gauzy fabric, or maybe it's kind of a metal screen that's been folded and used to create, you know, this almost face, this sort of empty face. And so I love the comparison of these two for the show in thinking about, you know, her even self-portrait of herself, where, you know, her face is both elided and she reappears in profile, and then this later work where, you know, the face is actually absent in the work. And so that human element is both absent and present, in some ways refers back again to the technique of the photogram. So that is a quick run through the history of cameraless photography over 2 centuries and related media, and the relationship between art and science in this work. So Penley, what do you think? Should we open it up and hopefully have a bit of a conversation? We can also look at any of the works we discussed more closely, if that's of interest.
Yeah, that would be great. Do people have questions, comments, thoughts? Anybody inspired to try this at home? Have you tried it at home? Hi, Louise. What do you want to say?
Back in the 1940s, when I was in school, we had packs of that paper, and we made prints of leaves.
You were doing it.
Something that school children were doing in the 40s. And while I'm on personal history, back in 1969, I did an exhibition at the FOG called Early Science at Harvard, and we borrowed a great deal of material from the historic scientific instruments collection. So I'm thrilled that that's happening again. And I also borrowed from the biological labs and the Farlow Library.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I can't wait to see your exhibition.
Oh, thank you, Louise. Yes, it was actually, you know, it was the kind of thing where realizing, you know, this is a show that really is a collections-based exhibition. So it features primarily these photograms in the Hoeger estate, but then also with several of those key loans from our Harvard colleagues, but also other works from our own collection, like the Runge, the Moholy-Nagy will include, you know, work by Annelise Hoge, and some new photograms that we've recently added to the collection by Christian Schad and Elfriede Stegemeyer. So really also using it as an opportunity to expand our own collections also with work by women in this medium was a real goal for the show. But yeah, to just literally write to the collection of historical scientific instruments and be like, I'm working on this artist. This is what I know about, you know, when she was working, what she was doing. And they were like, oh, this is the perfect microscope for you. So it was pretty easy actually. And we'll include some slides and likely a diagram to help explain to our visitors how that, you know, microphotograph would have been created. We can't actually recreate the entire camera attachment that Hager likely would have been working with, but we are going to also have a video as you enter the exhibition that also just explains, you know, what is a photogram. And it's interesting because you say you were doing it as a school child, because that is also, you know, part of that reception, right? Is that, you know, it's so easy that a child could do it. It really is the place to start in photography classes. So I've talked to a lot of photographers and they say, yeah, if you want to start explaining analog photography, right, starting with the photogram is a great place to, you know, start to explain that. And I saw that in 2015 And we did an exhibition called Folding Refraction Touch, and did show some of our other photograms from the collection. And students were thrilled, to look and try and unpack a photogram. And it was a great entry point, right, for thinking about analog photography as well. So a lot of elements we hope that we can draw out there.
Thank you.
Other comments, anybody?
I see a question from Kara. Did scientists who created these images consider themselves photographers in the artistic sense? Did they think about composition? Well, that's a great question, Kara. It's hard to say with someone like Lindner. I mean, he really gets into the nitty gritty in his book. Someone like Karl Struve, where I said we have works in our collection, was actually not a scientist, but employing those techniques. He was actually ordering slides from a kind of scientific catalog, but he actually retrofitted his microscope so that the ocular was rectangular. So we saw with Anneliese Hager's microphotographs that it was still a circle, right? Because that was kind of the typical of the scientific. And Struve wanted to basically say, he wanted to move it into the realm of art. And so by making it a rectangle, right, kind of was signaling that artistic context. So I think, someone like Atkins, I mean, they are stunning prints. I mean, regardless of the fact that it was a scientific enterprise, I mean, she really was embracing, what the medium of cyanotype could do. And I would argue for Ella Hurd, whose work I found in the botany library, there are some that feel more like place and exposed to light. And there are some where she really is, I was standing there with my colleague, Danielle Castronova, and we were like, whoa, that's an amazing, composition. So actually for the exhibition, I chose one of each, right? One that felt a little bit more sort of straightforward, and one where we really did feel like she was creating a composition with her fern specimens. So, it's one of the critiques actually of art museums when they show the work of someone like Atkins, that they in some ways tend to decontextualize it, right? And make it almost like a unique artwork on the wall. And, of course they do, because they're so rare that, there are only a few existing albums. And so that's where the Hurd comparison will hopefully help us show that, Atkins may not have been thinking about the individual cyanotype in that way. Does that answers your question? But I think, I think so much of what Hager is doing, and she is very much an artist, is coming from that close looking and obviously the understanding of the photographic techniques that she learned through the natural sciences, right? So I guess I'm trying to say, in some ways, by looking at her work, we can start to, re-examine what science, where that intersection was between science and art. And, that's part of the new vision photography in Europe at the time, right? Moholy-Nagy talks about microscopy and microphotography, right, as new ways to see the world. So it's part of a larger push to kind of retrain our eyes, or retrain the way that we think about the world. And science, played a huge role in that as well. That's why it's been great to partner with Penley on this, who is herself a scientist and a specialist in silhouettes. So it was really a fantastic coming together to start to unpack some of these photograms from the very beginning. We were puzzling together.
Still puzzling about some of them. Some of them are so, the materials are just hard to figure out, like, is it fractured glue? Is it fractured ice? I mean, they're really beautiful, and we can't wait for you to come see them in person and give us your ideas. Like, this one is pretty complicated, the one that is being shown by Lauren. Do you have any ideas for that, Lynette, or anybody?
I first read it really as largely textile, but there's also something else going on there that feels like fluid. and where I think we are seeing maybe here also the use of projection. So we have seen in a number of them, we know she had an enlarger, both because she used a photograph of herself in that first self-portrait we talked about, but also I found documentation that she did get an enlarger from Umbo as well. And this is a work from the 50s, so she may have had better equipment by then, but it does seem that there are actually multiple exposures, multiple projections happening, and that it's likely not just that very dominant textile-like form. It's been helpful to look at, so many. I mean, we really are now the center for Anneliese Hager's work in the world. So, and we will show in the exhibition some copy prints that Umbo made of her photograms, which are now I don't know where they are. And that looking at those copy prints actually allowed me to understand better some of our unique photograms, because she did work in series. So the photogram that you talked about so much here, Penley, maybe we could come back to this one more. Sorry, I'm in the sun, sort of trying to avoid the light. This, there are a number of copy prints where you see that she's actually used that same scratched away background in the projection. So it actually, this part starts to feel almost like a stage. And then she puts different cutouts and different masks and different things on top. So she was also thinking, although, this was a unique photogram, she was using that same projection again and creating a related work. So that was very helpful to see. Yeah, and that one as well. There are several variants of this one as well. And where she's reusing those same paper cutouts in different ways, or she's using the negative part of the cutout as opposed to the positive part of the cutout and reversing it. Right, so you can see actually where Lauren was just pointing, sometimes she's actually literally using the reverse, like Penley showed with those profiles of the negative and the positive in the same image, which then cues us into the fact of, how a photogram is made. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can give ourselves a break before we approach other new acquisitions today. All right, I'm going to take that as a sign.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Penley, and thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
And Shannon.
Look forward to the opening on March 4th and to examining these and the other works from our collections together with you. And we are hoping to actually have materials lab programming in the spring, where we can also make our own cyanotypes in order to approximate Hager's process in the way that Penley did. So,
thank you.
bye, everyone.